Hello, this is George Mueller, and this video is intended to be the second part of an introduction to the history of the Roman Republic for students in my History 101 class. When we left our story last time, the Romans had conquered the Italian peninsula, and they were setting off on the road to conquer the rest of the Mediterranean world. Now they're going to arrive there through a series of, frankly, opportunistic moves and, well, the need to deal with real threats. Now, the first major enemy Rome is going to face is the old Phoenician colony of Carthage. Carthage was an unpopular city with other nations. Dealing with Carthage was fraught with danger. They were aggressive, opportunistic, and frankly dealt very unfairly with other nations. It's also very heavily a slave culture, even more so than Rome, so doesn't go down in history with the best reputation. Now, the first war between Rome and Carthage is called the First Punic War, and this war is very interesting. It's different than any other war Rome had fought. It's primarily a naval war, not a land war. The Carthaginians, of course, are in North Africa. You can see them right here. Not accessible by land from Rome. And what that means in practice is the Romans and the Carthaginians are fighting mostly over Sicily. So Rome has to build a navy. And they do. They build a navy of nearly 100 ships in just 2 months. And in doing so, come within a hair's breadth of kicking off the Industrial Revolution in 264 BCE. That would have changed things. But they don't. However, the Romans do win the war on the sea, and then lose it on the land, which is the opposite of what everybody expected, including the Romans. This war is eventually ended, essentially by both cities running out of money. So, peace sets in. The two actually ally at one point against a third party, but eventually a second war breaks out. This time, Carthage is determined to deal with Rome once and for all. They send their greatest general, Hannibal, who has literally been trained since birth to be a general, to invade Italy. He does so by landing in Spain and then moving overland, collecting an army of mostly Celts to invade Italy proper. Famously, he has elephants in this army. Not so much as direct military tools, but because everybody will come to see the elephants, they're kind of like a walking billboard. Once he's in Italy proper, he's going to stay there for a very long time, 16 years. And that's because, as great a general as Hannibal is, he's never able to overcome the fortified cities of the Romans. And he's never able to convince Rome's allies, those other Italian allies, to break with Rome. And what that means is that the Romans can fight him by avoiding direct battles, instead cutting off his lines, preventing him from gathering supplies, and whittle away at his army a little at a time. And they had to do this because at the Battle of Cannae, the Romans had lost 40,000 men, and they really were very close to collapse. The Romans also did something very interesting. They did have a great general of their own. They didn't send him to fight Hannibal. Instead, they sent him to Spain and broke Spain free from the Carthaginians first. And then, at the Battle of Zama, actually invaded Carthaginian territory while the Carthaginians were still in Italian territory. Hannibal was recalled, but he was with a new army that he hadn't trained himself, and he's defeated at the Battle of Zama. This leaves Carthage permanently diminished. The Third Punic War will break out partially at the behest of this happy-looking fellow. His name was Cato the Elder, also known as Cato the Censor. His job in the Roman Republic was to punish people who violated social norms. So he's a happy guy. Now, he ended every speech, even ones about things like repairing a road, with the Latin phrase Centero senso Carthaginium est dolendum. And furthermore, I feel that Carthage must be destroyed. When the Carthaginians got into a dispute with their neighbors, the Numidians, a really interesting group in North Africa, who were Rome's close allies, they asked for Roman adjudication of the matter. When the Romans found in favor of the Numidians, Carthage went to war. And Rome utterly destroyed Carthage. They went to the, pardon me, they went to the trouble of pulling down the city and flooding it with seawater so that no crops would grow there. Now, for centuries, this was believed to be a myth, but it was actually found that this really did happen, and they really did pursue this utter scorched earth policy. Further Roman actions in the Mediterranean included punishing Greek cities for their support of Carthage, including by making Macedonia a Roman province under direct Roman rule, and actually leveling and completely destroying the city of Corinth. Also, Rome acquired some territory that will be important a little later on in a really interesting manner. The kingdom of Pergamum had a king who was dying with no heir, and he decided that he would leave his kingdom to the Roman Senate in his will, making Pergamum a close Roman ally, and kind of a closer Roman ally than any other. It was a very interesting move that worked out really well for the people of Pergamum, including some things that you'll see in a minute. Now, this Roman expansion was very opportunistic. It's willful, but it's not like they had a plan that they followed. They had threats that they dealt with, and they wound up with more and more clients over time. The problem with an empire is that they don't come free, and the Romans had acquired theirs at a considerable expense. And most of that expense wound up falling on the peasant class. The Roman army didn't pay well, and there were options for Roman soldiers to get rich. Plunder was completely legal and expected, but most of the plunder went to officers, and common men frequently came back after serving years in the military with no savings at all. And that meant that peasants were slowly losing money and losing their literal ground. Their farms were being sold to the rich. And there was a division amongst the elites about what to do about this. Something had to be done because there was a property requirement to be in the Roman army. And some rich thought that this was something that the peasants needed to take care of themselves. Others had ideas about redistributing wealth. Now, this is going to be something that comes up again and again in European and world history. The idea that a way to fix an inequality in wealth is to simply have the government go in and take money from some people and give it to others. It's a very heavy-handed tactic and technique, and it only really works if you can overcome the resistance of the wealthy. If you're taking money from the wealthy, they're naturally going to resist. In this case, the politician who was pushing this idea of land reform was Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus. He and his brother, whose name was Gaius Gracchus, were prominent politicians who worked representing the populares. Now, they were from a wealthy and well-respected family, but they were primarily popular with the populares. And they had a plan to redistribute land from the wealthy to the poor. Now, on the face of it, it seems like a good idea. The problem was they didn't deal with some of the problems, and a better politician could have made this program work. But for all that Tiberius Gracchus was in many ways a brilliant politician, he was also arrogant and had some personal qualities that made him a less than perfect reformer. And remember, he's going to be one of the people who gives Western society distrust of reformers. So you're seeing a standard set here. This idea of land redistribution will remain pertinent up to the modern day. On the other hand, this fear of what reformers will do remains current up to the modern day. So the reason that this land could be redistributed was because of a law that was in effect in Rome that remains in effect throughout most of Europe up through the 19th century, and one that still has some impact today. And that land law goes like this. Land that wasn't owned by anyone belonged to the city of Rome in general, to the government. And anyone could use that land. Now, mostly what this meant was you could raise animals on that land. And this was a way for peasants who didn't otherwise have land to have the option of having some sheep and maybe a few cows. At the same time, there's still a societal need for land to be improved, things like draining swamps, for that land to be improved and houses to be built there. So there was a law that said, if you improve the land and put a fence around it, it's yours. You could have free land. This is still a law in some places in, for example, the Western United States and many other countries. So this still can happen. The problem is, it's a lot easier to do this if you're rich than if you're poor. Particularly once you own slaves, it's very easy to go out and carve out a huge farm from land that's free. And on the other hand, if you're poor, you have to be raising crops to feed yourself. And it's much, much more difficult. So the idea was take land from the rich, give it to the poor. And this sounds great on paper. The problem is that they never dealt with some of the basic issues. Number one was that land had been distributed unequally amongst the wealthy and even just the upper middle class. And because those families often had more than one son, that means that land had been divided up amongst the sons. And some sons had land that, some sons only had land that had been public lands. And in fact, most of Rome's countryside had been public lands at one point. So how far do you go back? And you're going to take some men who are wealthy or middle class and take all their land from them and then make them poor. Are you going to decide on some arbitrary amount? Are you going to try and divide it up in some way? And how will that work? These were the kinds of basic problems that should have been dissolved under political pressure. No. These are the kind of problems that should have been solved by a debate amongst politicians. The sides should have gotten together and dealt with these problems before the law was passed. But Tiberius was... These were the kind of issues that should have been solved through concessions made between the various groups. There was an understanding something needed to be done, and yes, it was a pressing matter, but it wasn't that pressing. It wasn't the kind of emergency like a flood. But Tiberius acted like it was. He wanted to do it while he was in office. It was his goal, and he had 1 year. So he had little time to spend fixing his law. That's going to be a mistake. Tiberius instead resorted to trying to pressure his political enemies in very obvious ways. He had a gang of followers who were described by contemporaries as thugs. They actually carried clubs. You couldn't wear a sword in Rome unless you were in the military and on active service. So he had a gang of thugs, and then he appeared in royal attire. And he spoke well of how he had read about things like Greek tyrants. And since Rome had this real fear of kings, they're really worried about him. And this speaks to a larger Western issue. It's this fear of, well, reformers. Reformers are dangerous. If they're changing things, you don't know how much they're going to change. And Tiberius looked like he was going to change a lot. And in particular, some of his actions really left him in danger. The particular thing that brought about his death almost directly had to do with the election. What happened was, Tiberius was serving a term of 1 year in office. When he left office, he decided he would immediately run again. You weren't supposed to do that. The standard in Roman law was to run, then not run for a year. If you'd committed any crimes while you were in office, then you could be tried for them. And then you could run again. And this spread out the offices amongst more people. So he was taking a blatantly illegal action. And then it became obvious he wasn't going to win the election. So he decided he already was skirting the law. He would simply take control of the election. He had a gang of thugs. Rome had one voting place. Put your gang of thugs into the voting place, and you have the recipe for a disaster. He was fixing the election. Now, when the Roman senators found out about this, they took decisive but illegal action. And you're going to read about that in a document exercise. In the end, not only was Tiberius killed, but 200 to 300 of his followers were also killed and dumped in the river. And, according to the stories that we have, it was banned that anyone talk about what happened. That means one of the most prominent, well, let's face it, the most prominent politician in Roman life disappeared one night along with his primary followers, and no one was allowed to speak of it on pain of death. Terrifying. Now, Tiberius' brother, Gaius, survived and followed in his brother's footsteps, up to the point of also being killed when he attempted to interfere with an election. These two are going to leave Rome in a bad place. Rome was bitterly divided. The people who had followed the Gracchi, Tiberius and Gaius, were known as the Populares. They represented the people. On the other hand, the people who had opposed them, the old wealthy aristocracy of Rome, different from the old nobility, this is just the wealthy, they were known as the Optimates, the best people. And the fight between the two is going to shape politics, well, for the rest of the Roman Republic. But we're going to stop here, and I'm going to do a separate video that goes into that. So stay tuned for part 3.